today's speaker, Professor James R. Elliott received his PhD in sociology with a minor in geography from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has held positions at the University of North Carolina's Population Center, Tulane University in New Orleans, the University of Oregon, where he is at the moment, and from the fall he will be at Rice University in Houston, Texas. Professor Elliott's scholarship focuses on urban development and social inequalities in the United States, ranging from research on native and foreign-born migration, racial and gender inequalities in the labour market, struggles over public housing, and social vulnerabilities to environmental hazards. His talk for us today builds particularly on this latter topic, from ongoing research that investigates the cumulative social and environmental changes produced by hazardous waste accumulation in urban areas. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Professor Elliott today.
All right, thank you. I think I'm mic'd up. Is this
Yep.
decent volume? Okay, great. Anyway, welcome back from spring break. Mine has just begun. So it's just awesome to be able to start it here in Pullman, where I've never been. So I want to thank you all for allowing me to come up and explore the Palouse and share some research with you. As Richard mentioned, broad training in social demography, interest in urban development and social inequality, and increasingly how that intersects with the environment. So part of that is a project that I'll be sharing with you today that I'm working on with a friend and colleague, Scott Frickel, from here in Washington State. And it's premised on this radical notion that sustainable societies of the 21st century are going to need sustainable cities. And so the question is that we face is, as sociologists, how are we going to help contribute to that? And one way we think is to begin helping to develop an environmental sociology of cities and urbanization. It's been there in latent form, but we think we can make it more manifest and move that forward. So I'm going to try this clicker, and I do tend to be a walker. I love walking around. I'm going to try to stay put, but we'll see what happens. Since you have Bill Cronin, who actually Scott and I took environmental history courses from at the University of Wisconsin, coming later this week, I thought I'd start with this image. As many of you know, he's got a great essay entitled The Trouble with Wilderness, but you could easily retitle it The Trouble of Cities. And basically part of the premise is that, you know, we have these cultural constructions. We have this cultural construction of nature that's over there and absent of humanity and society, and the opposite construction of society and nature, or society and people absent of nature. And there are all sorts of problems with this cultural construction. Obviously, in the wilderness component, there's lots of human history, from genocide and then public policy that created this wilderness, oftentimes for elite consumers. And then also in the city, where we begin to see these buildings, and it hides from us the fact that there is indeed still nature in cities, and it's continually being produced. So part of the challenge of developing an environmental sociology of urbanization in cities is to go back home, as Cronin talks about. And for most of that, for us and the planet, that's in cities, in urban areas, and begin to rediscover not just the nature, but the production of nature in those spaces. So this is part of the broad contours in which some of this plays out. So when we go into cities and we begin to try to recover and find this nature, one of the things we find is that this nature is increasingly about pollutants, how we as society transform nature into commodities and various other items, and in the process create wastes that are hazardous to our health and to the planet. And so one of the ways we know this is through government agencies such as the Environmental Protection Agency, which puts out these reports since the 1980s known as the Toxic Release Inventories. So these reports try to track industrial waste, and we can use that to begin to think about how it's transforming urban areas and urban nature. So when we look at this, my students always go, wow, that data's so old, man. It's 2010 to 2011. It's 2014. But you know the deal. It takes a while to get the data, process it. So these are the most current data, at least as of a month or two ago. And what we see is that the Environmental Protection Agency divides up pollutants or hazardous waste into different forms of emissions. So we have on-site emissions from air or into the air and into the water. And what we see is when we go into the urban nature and see the hazardous waste, the largest component or form of release and the fastest growing is actually release of hazardous waste to land. And so what we see here, again, the scale over there is in millions of pounds. So we're talking, 2.5 billion pounds of hazardous waste deposited on site on industrial facility lands every year. And turns out that this is just part of the releases, right? Because the toxic release inventory only tracks pollutants from a certain type of industry or facility. It has to be in a certain sector known to pollute. It has to release at least 25,000 pounds each year of some toxic that we know about and regulate. And it also has to employ at least 10 full-time equivalent employees. So even when you make those sort of constraints and those criteria, we get these large sums that are being deposited to land. And we can come back and talk about why more and more to land. This is one of the unintended consequences of cleaning up the water and cleaning up the air. More and more of our pollutants now increasingly end up in the land. Okay. So as sociologists, as we begin to recover this nature, the question is, how are we going to frame or reframe the problem, at least for sociological analysis? So the common way, and the source of much literature in environmental justice, is this sort of snapshot where we're late after the 1980s. We have the toxic release inventory. We know where hazardous sites are now located thanks to this inventory. And we begin to find out where people live relative to these known sites. So it's a snapshot or synchronic analysis where we say, okay, where's the bad stuff that we know about and who lives nearby? Incredibly important still, because oftentimes people in these neighborhoods are marginalized and disempowered by various forms of disinvestment. So we need to empower and bring attention to these environmental inequalities. But in terms of analysis, one of the things that this leaves out is history and process. So if we're going to develop more theoretical understandings of this problem and this transformation of nature, we have to begin to think about process and sort of history. So one way in which people began to do this maybe 10, 15 years ago is to put these various components in motion. So they say, okay, we know where the hazardous site is located now and it's polluting, but we can use data sources to go back and find out when it actually established in that area. And or we can begin to use census data or community records to find out when different types of communities or subpopulations moved into that space. So this begins to add a historical dynamic element that begins to help theorization and understanding of what David Pellow calls sort of this production of environmental inequalities or inequality formations. This is great too, but one of the odd things about it is it sort of looks at history through the wrong end of the telescope in some respects. It goes in from the present, looks through the big end, and looks narrowly back to see what we know about the things we currently understand to be problematic. It's ahistorical in that sense. It starts in the present and works back. But what happens if we take history seriously in this process? Well, what we have to begin to acknowledge and recognize is that there are plenty of hazardous manufacturers who dumped waste on site in lands before there was any regulation that put them into the sort of the public knowledge base. And so these are what Scott and I call relic sites, whereby hazardous industrial facilities have operated, likely deposited poisons on the land, but then ceased to be operating by the time these records start to be kept. And so to develop a fuller understanding, theoretical understanding of this, we think we need to develop a perspective that encompasses all of this. And it's important to go back to the 1930s because that's when the volume and the toxicity of industrial waste really begins to increase quite dramatically. So we need to go back and follow that forward. So that's sort of the empirical or analytical frame. Then the question is, well, what theoretical framework are we going to use to try to understand this as we put it in motion? And I'll go light on the details now, but we can come back. But what we think is that we can go back to early human or urban ecology of the Chicago School from the 1920s and 30s and begin to resurrect and recover key theoretical conceptual ideas and repurpose them for this task. So one of the key concepts we want to use is this notion of succession, this idea of gradual incremental changes that feed on each other but over time amount to cumulative significant change in a way we might not immediately appreciate. What we want to do is integrate that notion by bringing society and nature into contact with one another so that we begin to see how nature is produced within urban areas, not just taken over or filled. And so we want to really emphasize this intertwining over time of nature in terms of the land and the soil and social processes. And so as we do that, again, we're not taking that slide from before and thinking about a linear aspect of time where history just sort of goes like this, but it's actually history repeating itself. Society and urban spaces changing nature that feeds back, and then it gets changed over and over endogenously over time in the same physical space or piece of nature. So to understand this, what we want to do is think about the sub-processes that contribute to this interaction or this sort of entwining of nature and society. And one key piece that we think about is industrial churning. And the shorthand of this is basically we have to realize that when industrial facilities open up, make some stuff, and then have this poisonous waste and then bury it on the land, they're going to do that. But they're not going to be in business forever. So when they get done doing their business and polluting the land, they're likely going to close shop. And something else is going to come in. And then maybe a new hazardous industrial facility is going to open up in the neighborhood. But it's not necessarily going to go in the same place. So it's going to open up down the block or a couple blocks away. And it's going to open up in another site. So as hazardous industry goes in and out of business in urban space, what it's doing is polluting sites when it's operating, then goes out of business, and when new ones come to operate, it begins to sort of spread these sites increasingly over urban neighborhoods and urban spaces in a way that sort of scales up from individual sites. So that's the industrial churning that's sort of spinning out this transformation of nature across urban spaces. At the same time, we know from the urban ecologists and since social demographers that there's quite a bit of demographic churning or invasion and residential secession in urban areas. As certain groups inhabit certain neighborhoods, they're there, but they're not there forever. New groups come in and begin to sort of invade or repopulate those neighborhoods. The most recent and iconic example I'll talk about in a little bit is gentrification, right? You have a group, oftentimes, of people of color or low-income working-class folks who become displaced through urban renewal processes. What we want to do is acknowledge that. That was always there in the Chicago school, but extend it to understand what that does culturally. What it does is basically, as newcomers come into an area, they don't just resettle it and establish their new institutions and clubs and churches and whatnot. They also, in the process, erase the public memory of what came before. So if hazardous waste, we know hazardous industry is there, but it's sort of operating and new groups come in and they're unaware of that history. You have sort of a cleansing or forgetting of that production of toxic nature or hazardous nature. In addition, this is the third component that's also interacting increasingly. We have this informal or general notion of risk containment, whereby the urban growth machine and political coalitions in cities increasingly have to acknowledge the fact that there is hazardous waste. After all, we can go online and see these reports. But they need to do it in a way that doesn't slow down the reuse and the continual sort of reinvestment in the urban core. Otherwise, that urban core can go fallow, and the sort of the rentier class and the land-based profits can begin to decline. And so what has to happen is we have to have, as a growth machine, a process that acknowledges this but still allows these other processes to continue so that we continually have the reuse of space. And so part of the risk containment strategy is to have folks focus specifically on problem sites and not the systemic nature of how these things continue to unfold and accumulate over time. So I'll come back to this, but this is the general process whereby society and nature are going to continue to intersect and entwine and change the nature of cities and remake it. Okay, so now to the research design. How are we going to study this empirically? So we start with the basic principle from the 1800s, Mill's theory of difference, where we take 4 similar cases that are very different on some key aspects that we think are important in terms of this churning and this accumulation of hazardous waste in urban areas. So all of these cities are riverport cities. They're all older historic cities. But they are in different areas of the country. We have Portland, Minneapolis, Philadelphia, and New Orleans. Not only are they in different geographic areas, but they have different racial compositions, racial politics, and environmental programs and policies. So they're very different on that respect. So we're curious about how those differences may manifest in terms of these processes. We also deliberately avoid selecting cities or areas in the classic Rust Belt, because what we want to point out is that this process of remaking urban nature so that these urban hazards and these toxic wastes or hazardous wastes keep expanding is not just happening in Camden and Toledo and Youngstown and Detroit and Pittsburgh, but is actually a part of 21st or 20th century American urbanization in general. So that's sort of the study site. And then the question is, okay, how are we going to get data? And what type of data are we going to get? So this is actually a multi-step process. And so there's a lot behind this, but I'm going to try to just give you the key components and then show you some of the results that come out of it. But the first step is to identify the industries in each city that are known to deposit hazardous industrial waste that we know that is harmful to humans and other ecological beings. Identify those sectors that are doing that in each city. And so what we thought originally is that we'd go to each four of these cities and they'd be very unique in terms of which sectors are doing this most prominently. And we were surprised to find that it's actually the same 7 sectors that are burying hazardous waste to land in all 4. And so you can see them there, from chemicals on over to transportation equipment. And in these cases, it's largely about shipbuilding and repair. And then we go to local sources. We verify that these local accounts from the EPA are sort of things that local historians and urban planners have been documenting. So we have the industries that we're concerned about. We have the cities where we're going to look for them. And so what we want to do, again, is to go back in time and follow these things forward. Not just start with the latest TRI and where the problem sites are and work back. So to do that, what we're going to do, or what we've done, is work with students to go to these directories of manufacturers. So each state in the country, starting in the 1950s, somewhere in mid-1950s, was sort of encouraged to have their Department of Economic Development go out and put together these yellow pages or directories of industry. There's a bit of connecting and networking and building the economy to have this information. But what's great about it is these directories you can use to go back, and they're subdivided by these different industrial processes or sectors. And so you can go back to the 1950s and you can begin to create a longitudinal database of all the facilities that have operated in those sectors over time up to the present, because the directories are still being published. So we have a longitudinal database. We take out obvious headquarter sites, and we sample every other year, and we come up with about 100,000 site years of data from these 4 cities that we're going to work with. Then that gets us at the industrial churning, but we want to think about how residents and different subpopulations begin to intersect with that. So this is where we have to go back and get the U.S. Census data. And we're going to use census data at the level of census tracts, which most of you probably know is a common proxy for neighborhoods. Typically a tract is drawn by local enumerators of the census to sort of contain maybe 4,000, 5,000 people. So we're going to use that to follow some basic demographic information. Then we're going to go out and find out what some of these sites have become, because a lot of them, again, in our database are older, and part of our proposition is that they're going to be converted to something else. So we sample about 100 sites in each city to see what's happening and what these sites look like now. And then finally, we merge this with local Department of Environmental Quality data to get a sense of the extent to which local government officials are, A, making these sites publicly acknowledged and available for scrutiny, and the extent to which they've actually gone out and remediated or helped remediate some of these sites. Because if all these sites are being remediated and the local authorities are on it, then maybe this isn't a problem. Okay, so that's the multi-step collection. So let's think about the industrial churning. So I'm going to start with just broad information across the 4 cities. So, woohoo, a graph. It's sunny. Can't have a sunny day without a graph. So we've got number of hazardous sites over there, And on the bottom, we have the year, so we can follow it through. And then what we've done here is subdivide the facilities that we observe based on the employment data that we get out of the manufacturing directories. So what we can do is first say, okay, let's look at the large ones. These are the ones that people typically identify. Oh, yeah, I know that's a hazardous industry. That might be a problem. Let's keep an eye on that. So even with all this deindustrialization and radical transformation of the U.S. economy and whatnot, what we see is a fairly constant number of large facilities operating and likely dumping hazardous waste on land. About 200 across the 4 cities. If we add medium, which is still above the threshold of 10 employees, these are the ones that are technically still available or make themselves available to review by the Environmental Protection Agency. But that's only after 1983 and federal legislation. So most environmental justice research and most research that focuses and uses TRI data to study these types of issues is really only focusing on this blackened sector here. It ignores the smaller facilities. So what happens if we use our database to follow those or track those? How many of those are there? And again, it's fairly constant, which sort of surprised us, but it about doubles the amount of facilities. So the yellow are the facilities that are, again, going unregulated. But what if we expand that even more to say, what about all the sites that were active but are no longer active? What if we begin to add those up? Historically, if none of these things went out of business, there would be no relic waste sites, right? They'd all be operating. We know where they are. We might miss some because they're small. But if they are churning and opening and closing across other spaces, we will get relic sites. So how many do we have? That's how many we actually have. So for every sort of one data site we have in the TRI, we have about 10 to 12 other sites that aren't really regulated. And if you look over time, how many of those were ever subject to regulation because they sort of met these criteria after 1983? Only about 22% have been under the possibility of regulation acknowledgement. I don't know about your students, but I mean 22%, I mean you wouldn't give them an F. You find like a G or an H, right? You'd find some other letter to give them because that's just, I mean, that's abysmal. I mean, here's the mandate. Go out and be concerned and sort of focus on these sites. And at best, even if it all works, the process shows that you're only going to capture about 22% since 1960. We know this stuff has been going on since the 30s in this particular form. Okay, so that's big churning. Now we can begin to get into the neighborhoods and think about what's happening in the neighborhoods with respect to who's there. But before we ask who's there, we want to just move from sort of cities as a whole to the tract level. So we can start with Portland. So what we have are 2 graphs. And so on the y-axis, we have the number of sites per square mile. So we're controlling for the size of the tract, so we can compare them. So in Portland, what we find is on the upper graph with the active sites, we have, what is that, about 10 or so on average in each census tract over time that are actively being produced. So that's about stable. That's what we'd expect from what we saw before. But what's happening, even with that stability, again, this is sort of shows you that that's happening on a smaller scale too, right? That even though active sites are not increasing in number at any given point, as they open and close over time, there's quite a bit of dynamism behind this constant. So the number of relic sites per square mile in the average tract is actually going up. And then we can just do a simple calculation of the standard deviation. This is what is the average difference from the average tract? So this is the structural basis of environmental injustice, right? Those tracts that tend to be sort of higher, their standard deviation is above or about double that, they're going to be sources of concern more than the sites that are lower. So anyway, broad point is that we have these trends. Relic waste is going up on average, as is the unevenness of how it's accumulating across the city in different neighborhoods. And so for the sake of time, just you can repeat these, but the general point's the same. You can have constant levels of active sites or declining, but you tend to have increasing accumulation at the relic sites and increasing inequality. So we think 2 things are going on. It's becoming more systemic, it's spreading out across more parcels, but in the process it's also unequal. So you can think of it as systemic but unequal accumulations. Okay, now that we're in here, we can begin to think about who becomes exposed or who lives in close proximity or in these neighborhoods and tracts. Okay. So we use some statistics. The key thing for you to realize is the unit of analysis is a tract. It's this sort of geographic space that approximates a neighborhood in a given city. And we run what's known as a panels fixed effect model. We do some math. There's a formula. And what we do is then we add the census data so that we can sort of observe that tract over time as it changes with respect to the amount of relic waste sites it has and as the population changes in that area with respect to different types of people moving in and out. And our key variables of interest, the ones we're trying to predict or explain, the dependent variable, if you will, is active sites per square mile that we just saw and relic sites per square mile. So I'm going to focus largely on the relic sites. And the key variables that we're going to use just from the literature for now, for the simplicity, are just the basic class and race variables that we can follow from the 1950s. We wish we had better data on foreign-born populations or on Latino populations or that sort of thing. But if you go back to the census data from the 1950s and go forward, you have very crude measures. So basically we have percent white and we have median family income. We have our race and class measures. So what we're going to do is have some fun with that. No, that looks horrible. That is what's behind this. So let's start with Portland. So active sites. What I've done here is I've done a bunch of regressions with Scott's help. He's great at this. And what we can do is then plot the marginal effect and how it changes over time. So the white line down there is for white or white composition, and the black is for the income. And what this you can see over there, this is the marginal effect. It's negative. So what this says over time in Portland, the higher your income and the higher the percent white in your neighborhood, negative, the lower the concentration of active sites in your neighborhood. Common EJ finding, right? That basically if you have some power by virtue of your white privilege or your income, you keep that stuff over there, and the people who don't have the money or the white privilege have to absorb that. So that's the negative relationship. But we were curious, well, what happens if you don't know it? Relic waste sites, one of their characteristics is they're sort of hidden. You don't know about it. And so one thought is, well, maybe there's not that same form of environmental injustice. If you don't know about it, you won't distance yourself from it. And that's what we see. So the dotted lines in these graphs are going to indicate statistically insignificant results. Just trust me, there's some math. It's true. So what it says is basically, although wealthier or higher income and white neighborhoods tend to keep hazardous waste from accumulating in their areas, they tend not to have any difference with respect to exposure to relic waste that are hidden. So we can go through this, and we can go to New Orleans, Minneapolis, and Philadelphia. And again, there's lots of interesting stuff in here, but for the sake of time, I just want to focus on these three down here. And what we find here is this, these solid lines mean it's statistically significant, and again, the white line is going up. So what it says is that over time, as neighborhoods become whiter, those are the neighborhoods that are actually have the highest densities of relic industrial waste. That there's something going on that is increasingly exposing white residents to these wastes. This is the opposite of the traditional environmental justice story. And we don't think these data refute the environmental justice story. What they do is they help put it in larger context. Because what we think is happening is basically as the growth machine and the reuse of urban lands for profit is happening, there's gentrification of these old industrial sectors near the central business district that become attractive lofts and bars, places I love to go, and my students want to live, and all that great stuff. And it happens in this way. And so we can get back to what the political implications are at the end, but it's a very different picture, but we think one that's part of and attaches to the contemporaneous studies of environmental justice. So how does this happen? How is it that white neighborhoods are increasingly the ones that have the highest density of these problem sites where we find the most relic waste if we went looking and digging through history and the earth? And one way is through reuse, right? this is the erasing of memory. Not only did I come into a neighborhood that's now been changed, and I don't really know what came before, and I don't really care because I want to get my game on and have a good time, but now I don't even see evidence of a problem. So here's a former hazardous site. We went around to our site visits. So here are some just random pictures from our site visits. In Portland, one of our relic sites becomes an inner city playground and child care facility, convention center, a new urbanist condo development that has coffee shops and housing. Then we can go to New Orleans. We got our boutiques, and it wouldn't be replete without a strip club. The Orleans Levee Board. In Philadelphia, we finally, out of 400 site visits, we find an area that looks like, oh my gosh, that's a site I would think of as dangerous. And now it's a super fun site. But that was the exception. And it was way outside the inner city core and often well fenced and overgrown. Most of the time it was, a parking lot next to a new business in town or a new green space where I'd love to eat lunch, looks sunny, and, urban agricultural amenity boutique shops, Marvin's garden shop. So again, part of the hiding is people moving into the neighborhood, not knowing what came before, and looking and going, this is the post-industrial city. It's clean. That nasty stuff isn't there anymore. But it actually is. It's in the land. It's been dumped there, and it lingers. So what have they become? What have these sites become? So I showed you some pictures, but if we look across all the sites that we went and sort of surveyed, this random sample, there's various things that we could talk about in here, but I just want to sort of show you this graph and highlight a couple general points. The red is continued hazardous industrial use. So this is the site that we saw and it went out of business, now being reused by some other hazardous sector that we're not studying. So importantly, there's actually a little bit of this. In most cities, there's not. The vast majority of conversion is into these commercial or civic sites, examples I just showed, and residences. So there's some vacant, but the modal transformation or conversion of these sites is to an active, non-hazardous activity, one that you would think of as being, hey, I wouldn't mind living near that. That's no problem. And so then we can begin to do some other math, and we do some regression analyses to think about, well, can we predict where certain sites are more likely to stay vacant and where are they more likely to convert into these other uses? And so we run some analyses. Again, the unit of analysis is, at this point, the site. What does this site become? Did it become one of those four things? And what is it about the neighborhood that might help us explain that? And what is it about the former facility, how big it was, what sector it was in, these sorts of things that might help us also predict. What we find, in short, is that the modal category of conversion to these non-hazardous uses is older, smaller sites. Sites that are easy to convert into coffee shops and loft apartments and these sorts of things, where the parcel is maybe a half an acre instead of 20 or 50 acres. But the important part is, sparing you the grief of all the numbers, is that when we put all these tract level variables in, it doesn't matter. You can tell us the racial composition of the neighborhood, the average age of the residential structures, the percent vacancy in the area, home ownership rates and income. None of that stuff matters. All the stuff is being converted to these non-hazardous looking things systemically everywhere across the city. Okay, this gets back to the question. Well, if it's converting, but it's being sort of investigated first and potentially remediated, no problem. So let's look at the extent to which local officials are actually going out and taking a look at this process and intervening. This gets into the risk containment. So lots of stuff, but I'll just try to bookend it here. Worst practice, New Orleans, we have 800 or so relic sites. We go and look at the public database that the municipal DEQ, or the Department of Environmental Quality, puts out, and none of our sites are on it. So this is a worst case scenario. There's no evidence, there's nothing that suggests the public can go and find out what the problem is. So let's go to Portland, which is actually the best case scenario. But Portland only has 6%. So we have many more sites. It's more industrially active than New Orleans. But only about 6% of our sites have received any sort of public documentation That doesn't mean they were remediated. That just means, hey, at some point we should take a look at that. And so what we have, again, is a process that's allowed to go. So in New Orleans, it's sort of like, nothing to see here policy, keep moving. And the best case scenario is like, oh yeah, there's something to see. It's that big factory over there. The hazard's over there. Not over here. We got a playground over here. It's cool. So what types of former sites are publicly identified and remediated? So we looked at Portland, the best case scenario. And what we found is it is those larger chemical and petro facilities that have operated for a long time. They are those large sites where everybody sort of knows, yeah, that end of town, bad news, stay away. So what happens is the local environmental officials, well-meaning but under-resourced, go, okay, we'll go over it, that's where it is. And oftentimes they target the visible sites in high vacancy neighborhoods. That is, in neighborhoods where the rentier class or the land-based elite really want to get commerce going again. The land's not being reused. How are we going to get it reused? And so what happens oftentimes is that the local DEQ, as well-meaning as it is oftentimes really about directing attention over there. You know, that's where the EJ should be done. That's where you should focus. And it's about basically then providing for what's known as liability-free redevelopment. Okay, we've identified that site. You, developer, if you want to do it, you go through some hurdles. They might differ depending on the city, but once you go through them, we will give you a get-out-of-jail card, or free card. that basically says, now you can never be held legally liable for anything on your land. Build, go, reuse, go, go. Let's get this circulation going again. Okay, so we're back to this. These are the processes through which, all intertwining together, change the nature of cities successively. One incremental stage at a time. A business goes in and out of operation, it dumps, it goes out of view, residents move in and out, the environmental policy is sort of doing what it can, but in a process, again, that focuses on sites and not on the systemic things that happen, and in a process allow this to continue on. So as a consequence, what we have is this, I hope this works, systemic spread where we just have more and more waste sort of gradually filling up more and more space across the city. And of course, you all now know that because you came to this talk. But most people didn't. And so they don't see anything. And so it's up to us to go out and enlighten and inform and discuss. And so that leads us to the final slide, which is contributions and implications. So some of you may be more interested in some of this than others, but theoretically, what we want to draw emphasis towards in this is not just the Chicago School and Secession, that's helpful, but to really draw attention back to the city, not just as a growth machine, growing out and expanding into suburban space and exurban space, that's happening. But we forget that a necessary condition of that now is actually the reuse of space. So we need to think more about the city as a reuse machine. How does it keep the inner core vibrant and making money and developing? So that's a theoretical reorientation. And in the process, how does that reuse contribute to the successive or incremental feedback loop between society and nature, where society changes that nature into a hazardous form, buries it, moves it on, and does it again, and systemically spreads this risk throughout urban areas across the country. So those are the theoretical things that we hope to sort of develop further. The methods, we think that this work is beginning to show that it's useful to use the historical comparative method across scales, to show how in ecological processes you can have the successive or recursive intertwining that scales up from sites to neighborhoods, to urban scale, and then increasingly probably to metro scale, and then maybe to megalopolis scale. So, you know, not just having, you know, city comparisons, but thinking about how you can leverage these ecological processes as they move and build and scale. And one of the things that we're excited about is the process that we put together, although it's got a lot of moving parts, is fairly easy to relay. We can teach people, we can develop a website, and the book that we're writing is going to have this, hopefully a do-it-yourself appendix that says, hey, you, local community, you can go to this website, click here. You can find out which industries are polluting. You can then go to your public library and you can find these manufacturing directories, and you can find the things in your neighborhood. And we can begin to have a dialogue between the typical EJ community that's underserved and disinvested and disempowered, and the gentrifying white neighborhood that's facing many of the same problems increasingly, and hopefully begin to have conversations that build up across the urban sort of political regime. I mean, that might be pie in the sky, but that's the hope. So the citizen science, not just for the disempowered, but for the empowered, and hopefully bringing them together and building broader coalitions. Policy, again, as I mentioned, the policy is hopefully moving towards more an idea of the understanding of systemic risk and the idea of systems and remaking of systems of risk and not just particular sites. And finally, this notion that oftentimes I talk with students about urban sustainability, and understandably, it's about the future, right? We have to develop a more sustainable future, and that's right. But what we also need to do is, in thinking about how we build the future, look back to see forward. We have to deal with the waste, the billions and billions of pounds of waste that are already accumulated in our cities if we're going to build forward and make those places truly sustainable. Thank you.
Okay, we've got about 15 minutes for questions and general discussion. Maybe I'll launch off with something. I didn't receive anything via my smartphone, so
okay.
I don't know if Vancouver Tri-Cities is watching at the moment. How dangerous is it? So in these relic sites, does it matter? I mean, it's okay, so rich people and poor people all exposed in their nice condos and bars. I mean, how dangerous is it for them?
Right, so the question, I'm supposed to repeat, right? How dangerous are these sites? That is a question that is important, certainly. What we try to do is stay out of that debate and not get in. There are different measures. You can get into the toxicity weighted measures of these things. But the point is we don't know. And so because a lot of these sites, the majority of these sites are unregulated, and because most urban landowners are not keen on people coming and watching Scott and I say, hey, we're going to direct the soil samplers over here and plummet your real estate values. This is one of those systemic risks that has built-in obstacles to knowing. So ours is more of a burden of proof argument, and it gets back to the cheeseburger conversation of Pulp Fiction, where the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. So what we want to do is put the burden of proof back where we think it belongs. If you read the federal policies and regulations, they say that government and public officials are supposed to go out and identify these sources of potential contamination and begin to assess the danger. So what we want to do is open the conversation, but we cannot say for sure that this site has explicitly this risk versus this risk. And we think that conversation is also complicated, Scott might be able to weigh in on this, by the fact that it's very difficult to understand the combinations of chemicals that people come into contact with. So to be able to sort of march this back through the medical community and say this particular compound from this particular industrial process on this particular site is the culprit for this is a problem. But one of the things, excited, it's probably the wrong word. The intellectual part of me is excited, but the other part of me is sort of wondering if I'm going to be disturbed. But one of the moves to Rice and Houston is being able to work with colleagues who have longitudinal data from the very large medical center there. And so one of the things that we have access to, or will have access to, is geocoded information for people who lived in Houston neighborhoods over 50 years. So we can begin to tease out some of this. There are also restricted use data from the Census Bureau in Haines. I don't know how many of you have heard of that. They do blood serum tests. And so there are opportunities to trace this back to public health and look at biochemical and sort of health outcomes. We're not sure we're the people to do it, but we're open and we're going to think about it. Thanks. I don't know your name, but you.
What is being done about the dangerous, hazardous sites that are large and known by the government? I was listening to the radio the other day and we were talking about the uranium mines here in Washington and how they're still poisoning all the people who live there.
Right. I'm sure there are people in this room who could speak to that much more than me. But Hanford site, of course, is the poster child for, okay, well, we have a really hazardous spot. we'll put in billions of dollars to try to remediate it, but we're not really sure how to do that in the best way we can. So I think the process is still experimental. But as I showed you in the Philadelphia case, that's a known site where the Superfund Act was enacted because this was a site that had lots of pollutants on site and couldn't be ignored. And so typically stage one, put up a fence. Stage two, we'll figure it out when we get the money and the scientists on this. But in the meantime, we'll see, if we can line up some developers who might be interested once we get it cleaned up. And so the short answer is, I wish I knew more, but what I know suggests that there's not a whole lot done. And sometimes the answer is simply to pave over things and hope that it gets entombed. And there's some suggestion that that's not always a bad strategy, but certainly it's not necessarily the only or the best strategy. Yes?
I was wondering if you could comment further. You made a comment about regulation. That's
Yep.
what you said, unregulated. Why wouldn't CERCLA apply in most of these cases?
Well, they do. CERCLA does apply in a sense. CERCLA, I wish I could. The question is, why doesn't CERCLA apply? The federal legislation that supposedly draws attention to these potentially contaminated sites. And the point is, it should, but it's under-resourced, and there's typically a raft of legislation that sort of works. And this is where, we become more sympathetic, or at least I have, to local officials who are charged with the responsibility of going out and applying CERCLA in their cities, because typically it's just a handful of people who are overwhelmed with paperwork and under-resourced in terms of the people they can send out. And they spend a lot of time just focusing, understandably, on the worst-case scenarios or those sites so that they can say, hey, look, we're doing our job. Because you can imagine if people say, well, we're down in the gentrifying area taking a look at things. They're like, well, what about that huge site over there? What are you doing? So it should apply. Part of our research says, is helping empower people so they can make the case that it should apply more, and then hopefully that leads to more resources.
How does this relate to suburbs and small agricultural cities like Pullman? Because
Yep.
Even in Colfax, we got industrial chemicals from industrial agriculture.
The bad news is, one of the reasons we focus on the urban core is twofold. We're interested in urbanization. That's where it's been happening longest. It's also relatively easy and contained to do historical work because the census tracts and the neighborhoods that we want to follow through time haven't changed a great deal. There have always been 4,000 or 5,000 people in the same neighborhood, so we can follow. In suburban areas, because they've grown quite rapidly over the last 50 or 60 years of our study, there's lots of change in terms of the data that's available to sort of get at the residential churning. But we know that suburban lands are being polluted. We know that outside even the 4 cities that we look at, that these hazardous industrial facilities are extending out along highways and along railways in ways that you would expect, and it's there as well. We just haven't gotten to that yet, and we know that's happening. And we know agricultural lands as well. It's being polluted through all sorts of sources. So this is not to say that the problem is worse in cities or only in cities. It's to sort of bring it back and show that the nature is being transformed in ways that we underappreciate. But hopefully, the coalitions can build across suburban, exurban, and smaller agricultural towns as well. Yes?
In comparing the race and income across the relic sites and things, you mentioned a lot about race with more whites and more weight, but income was an interesting one you didn't really talk about much.
Yeah.
You could speculate on how that relationship kind of stayed, maybe as we think, with the EJ literature.
Yeah, so the major findings we find with respect to income is that income becomes acts increasingly as a buffer. So it's sort of what you would expect, that as neighborhoods become wealthier over time, they become more buffered from both active and relic sites. And so we're still trying to figure some of that dynamic out, but there is some research on urban segregation that suggests, okay, the studies, what has happened to income or class segregation in urban and metropolitan areas as we've had this phenomenal increase in income inequality generally and wealth inequality. So they look at it from the 70s forward, and what they find is the uber elite, the ones in the very toniest of tony neighborhoods, are increasingly buffering themselves from the rest of the urban community in a way that hadn't happened before. So what we think is basically as younger white professionals are entering into the city, they might have sometimes had a choice to sort of occupy smaller houses in some of those wealthier neighborhoods. And now that's not happening. Those smaller neighborhoods are the richest neighborhoods have sort of swallowed up those smaller properties and redeveloped it. And so there is this more macro spatial segregation of the very wealthy that we think is contributing to that. But that part is consistent with both the income inequality story and with the environmental justice. So it's young working and professional class white college grads that are mostly experiencing most of this exposure. Good question. Yes?
Question. George, your talk.
Thank you.
So I was interested more about sort of talking about the state and the state not being, just environmental, but there's a lot of other urban, housing, urban development, and so forth, and using community block grants to gear all this gentrification happening. So I was wondering if in some of your research you're coming across the important role that non-environmental state agencies are having in structuring some of these outcomes.
Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't gotten into that, but there's no doubt about it. These block grants and how the urban renewal system works, and now increasingly with the emphasis on building density in the urban core and building up. And I know in Eugene that's a big issue, and there are various mechanisms that are happening. The other mechanism that we think is happening, it's been happening for a while, is preservation resources. So the U.S. Forest Service, I believe, runs the National Historic arm or what that administers loans for urban redevelopment of all things. So if you have a building in one of these historic urban areas that's older than 50 years, then if you want a redevelopment, you become eligible and you fill out a bunch of paperwork to get these low interest loans. And so there is, I think, part of that redevelopment, not just through block grants, but also through preservation issues that unintendedly sort of reproduce this succession and actually keep the reuse going. But it seems clear and clear that all these things are geared towards the city as a reuse machine as well as a growth machine, in a way that all these things come in and keep changing the land in ways that hide what's happening. But yeah, excellent question. Can I just say I'm impressed? I'm not sure, as much as I love Oregon and faculty and students there, I'm not sure we would have gotten this kind of draw and attentiveness the day after spring break. So again, I really appreciate your patience and you coming and sharing some time with me, and thank you.